The rain began the morning of her father's funeral, and Grace couldn't shake the feeling it would never stop. Philadelphia, January 1985. No, that wasn't right. January 1985, she would already be dead. This was January 1960. John B. Kelly Sr. had just died of stomach cancer at 70, and his daughter the princess had flown home for the first time since her wedding. Grace stood in the funeral home wearing black Dior, her hair perfect, her face composed, watching strangers file past her father's casket. They all wanted to touch her, as if royalty were contagious. "Your Highness," they whispered. "Princess Grace." She wanted to scream. She wanted to grab them by their coat collars and shout, "I'm his daughter, not a princess. I'm Grace Kelly, and my father just died without ever telling me he loved me." But she didn't. She smiled. She thanked them for coming. She played the role. Her mother sat in the front row, dry-eyed and distant. Margaret Kelly had perfected the art of emotional absence decades ago. Grace had learned from the master. Her siblings were there too: Peggy, Liz, Kel. Her brother Kel, the golden child, the son their father had actually loved. Kel was crying. Grace envied him that. She couldn't cry. Princesses didn't cry in public, and she'd forgotten how to cry in private. She stood by the casket and looked at her father's face, waxy and unfamiliar in death, and tried to remember a single moment when he'd been proud of her. When she'd won the Oscar, he'd said, "I thought you'd win for a better picture." When she'd married Rainier, he'd said, "At least you got a good settlement." When she'd given him his first grandchild, he'd asked, "When's the boy coming?" There was no moment. No memory of approval. Just a lifetime of reaching for something that was never offered. The priest was speaking now, eulogizing John Kelly as a great man, a self-made millionaire, an Olympic champion, a pillar of Philadelphia society. All true. But also incomplete. He was a tyrant who'd ruled his household like a kingdom. He was a man who'd loved conditionally and withheld constantly. He was Grace's whole reason for leaving Philadelphia, and he was the reason she could never really leave. She'd spent her entire life trying to prove herself to this man in the casket, and now he was gone and she'd never know if she'd succeeded. The math didn't work anymore. All those years of striving, performing, achieving, for what? For a man who'd taken his approval to the grave. After the service, Grace stood in the reception line shaking hands, accepting condolences, playing her part. An old family friend grabbed her hands. "Your father was so proud of you, you know. He talked about you constantly." Grace smiled. Lies. Comfortable lies. Her father had been embarrassed by her acting career until she became famous, then he'd taken credit for it. "I always knew she had it in her," he'd tell people, rewriting history with every retelling. When she'd married Rainier, he'd finally accepted her, but only because she'd married up, married power, married into a role he could understand. Princess was acceptable. Actress was not. Even in death, she was shaped by his judgments. Rainier touched her elbow. "We should go soon. The children are tired." He hadn't wanted to come at all. Monaco didn't stop for American funerals, not even for the princess's father. But Grace had insisted, one of the few times she'd overruled him. Now she wished she hadn't. Being back in Philadelphia was like stepping into a previous life, trying on a skin that no longer fit. The city felt small and grey and suffocating. She'd been desperate to escape it once, 23 years old and on fire with ambition, fleeing to New York and then Hollywood like the house was burning down behind her. Now she was 30, married, a mother, a princess, and Philadelphia still felt like a cage. Some prisons you carry with you. That night in her childhood bedroom at her mother's house, Grace couldn't sleep. The room was exactly as she'd left it in 1947. The same floral wallpaper, the same twin bed, the same desk where she'd written letters to drama schools. She sat at that desk now and opened the drawer. Inside were old journals, photographs, report cards. Evidence of a girl who'd existed before Princess Grace, before Grace Kelly the movie star. She pulled out a journal from 1946, when she was 17. The handwriting was round and eager, full of exclamation points. "I'm going to be an actress. I'm going to be famous. I'm going to show Father that I'm worth something." Reading it was like examining an artifact from an excavation. This girl felt foreign to her. When had she lost that certainty? That hunger? That sense of infinite possibility? Grace flipped through pages of teenage dreams and adult disappointments. An entry from 1950, after her father had refused to attend her Broadway debut. He'll be sorry. One day he'll see me on stage and realize he was wrong about me. An entry from 1954, after winning the Oscar. I thought this would feel different. I thought I'd feel whole. But I just feel tired. An entry from 1956, 3 days before her wedding. I'm terrified. Not of marriage, but of disappearing. What if I become someone else and can't find my way back? The last entry was dated April 18, 1956, the day before her wedding. Just one line. Tomorrow I become a princess. Today I stop being me. She closed the journal and put it back in the drawer. Outside, the rain was still falling, steady and relentless. Grace went to the window and looked out at the Philadelphia streets, dark and wet and empty. Somewhere in this city was the theater where she'd performed her first play. Somewhere was the corner where she'd waited for buses to New York, dreaming of Broadway. Somewhere was the girl who'd believed that talent and hard work and determination were enough. That girl was gone. Not dead, exactly. Just erased. Overwritten by other versions, other performances, until the original was unrecoverable. A soft knock on the door. Her sister Lizanne peeked in. Can't sleep either. Grace shook her head. Lizanne came in and sat on the bed, still in her funeral clothes. They'd never been particularly close as children. Lizanne was the pretty one, the social one, the one who'd married well and settled into Philadelphia life without questioning it. Grace had always felt like the odd one out in her own family. Too serious. Too ambitious. Too much. But now, sitting in their childhood bedroom while their father lay in a funeral home across town, they were just two women trying to make sense of grief. Do you think he was proud of me? Grace asked quietly. Lizanne was silent for a long moment. I think he didn't know how to be proud of daughters. Only sons. It was the most honest thing anyone had said all day. Grace felt something crack inside her chest. I gave up everything trying to make him love me. My career, my country, my whole identity. And it still wasn't enough. Lizanne reached over and took her hand. You didn't give it up for him. You gave it up for you. Because you were running. We all knew it. Grace wanted to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Because it was true. She'd married Rainier to escape Hollywood, escape the pressure, escape herself. She'd thought Monaco would be a fresh start. Instead it had been a different cage with better furniture. Do you regret it? Lizanne asked. Marrying Rainier. Becoming a princess. Grace thought about the question. Did she regret it? Yes and no. She regretted losing her career. She regretted the loneliness. She regretted becoming a symbol instead of a person. But she had 3 children she loved desperately. She had a role that mattered, even if it suffocated her sometimes. She had survived. That counted for something. I regret that there was no middle ground, Grace said finally. I regret that I had to choose between being an actress and being acceptable to father. Between being myself and being what everyone expected. I regret that women like us don't get both. They sat in silence, 2 sisters who'd taken different paths to the same destination. Lives shaped by their father's expectations, by men's approval, by the narrow roles available to women in 1960. Lizanne had married a nice Philadelphia man and joined the junior league and had children and done everything right, and she was as trapped as Grace in her palace. Different cages, same bars. What happens now? Lizanne asked. Now that he's gone. Grace didn't have an answer. She'd organized her whole life around her father's disapproval, and now there was just a void where his judgment used to be. Who was she performing for now? The rain intensified, drumming against the window. Grace stood and pressed her palm against the cold glass. In the reflection, she could see herself, 30 years old but looking older, wearing her dead father's judgment like a second skin. Behind her reflection, she could see the ghost of her 17-year-old self, still sitting at that desk, still writing in that journal, still believing that success would fix everything. The two Graces looked at each other across 13 years and a chasm of disappointment. What would she tell that girl if she could? Don't do it. Don't go to Hollywood. Don't marry the prince. Or would she tell her the harder truth? It doesn't matter what you choose, you'll lose yourself either way, because that's what women do. They disappear into the roles they play until they can't remember who they were before the performance began. Lisanne left eventually, and Grace was alone again. She thought about going downstairs, making tea, calling Rainier in Monaco. But she didn't. She sat on the twin bed of her childhood and let herself feel the full weight of her father's death. Not grief, exactly. Something more complicated. Relief, maybe. Or just exhaustion. She'd been performing for him for 30 years. Now the audience was gone and she didn't know how to stop the show. The rain kept falling. Philadelphia kept sleeping. And Grace kept sitting in the dark, wondering if she'd ever really left this room at all. She must have dozed off because when she opened her eyes, dawn was breaking and the rain had stopped. The house was quiet. Grace stood and looked at herself in the mirror above the dresser. Her makeup was smudged, her hair was loose, her Dior dress was wrinkled. She looked terrible. She looked human. For a moment, she thought about staying. Just staying in Philadelphia, in this house, in this room. Calling Rainier and telling him she wasn't coming back. Letting Princess Grace dissolve like sugar in water until only Grace Kelly remained. But that was fantasy. Grace Kelly was as dead as her father. She'd killed her years ago, buried her under layers of protocol and duty and performance. There was no resurrection possible. She fixed her makeup, repinned her hair, smoothed her dress. By the time she went downstairs, she was Princess Grace again, composed and perfect and untouchable. Her mother was already up, drinking coffee and reading the obituaries. "You're up early," Margaret said without looking up. "Couldn't sleep," Grace replied. "The rain kept me awake." Her mother made a non-committal sound. They'd never been close. Margaret Kelly had her own disappointments, her own buried dreams. She'd been a model once, beautiful and sought after. Then she'd married John Kelly and disappeared into his shadow. Grace had watched it happen. Had sworn it wouldn't happen to her. And then had married Rainier and done exactly the same thing. "What time is your flight?" her mother asked. "This afternoon," Grace said. "I need to get back to the children." It was a lie. The children were fine with their nannies in Monaco. But Grace needed to leave Philadelphia. Needed to escape this house full of ghosts and memories and the overwhelming presence of her father's absence. She'd come home for the funeral, but Philadelphia had never been home, not really. Home was a place where you could be yourself, and Grace had never been allowed to be herself anywhere. Not in Philadelphia, not in Hollywood, not in Monaco. She'd been a construct, a performance, a beautiful lie for so long that the truth had fossilized. At the airport that afternoon, Lisanne hugged her goodbye. "Take care of yourself," she said. "Write to me sometimes. Real letters, not the official princess stuff." Grace promised she would. She wouldn't. They both knew it. Grace boarded the plane and settled into her first-class seat. As Philadelphia disappeared below the clouds, she felt nothing. No relief. No sadness. Just the familiar numbness that had become her default state. The rain had stopped, but she could still feel it, a wetness that had seeped into her bones and wouldn't dry out. The flight attendant brought champagne. Grace accepted it and took a small sip. Across the aisle, a woman was reading a magazine. Grace caught a glimpse of the cover. It was a movie magazine with Elizabeth Taylor on it. Elizabeth, who'd also been a child star, who'd also been beautiful and famous and trapped by her own image. But Elizabeth fought back. Elizabeth got divorced. Elizabeth made scandalous choices and didn't apologize. Grace envied that. She'd never allowed herself to be scandalous. Even her marriage to Rainier had been respectable, approved, the fairy tale everyone wanted. She'd played it safe and lost herself in the process. She thought about her father's funeral, about standing by his casket waiting to feel something definitive. Love or hate or grief or relief. But there was just numbness. Maybe that was her inheritance from John B. Kelly Sr., not his Olympic medals or his millions. Just the numbness. The inability to feel anything real because real feelings were dangerous. Real feelings could derail the performance. And the performance was everything. It was all she had left. Somewhere over the Atlantic, Grace fell asleep and dreamed she was back in Philadelphia, standing in the rain outside her childhood home. She was 17 again, wearing a simple dress, her hair loose and wet. Her father was standing in the doorway. She walked toward him, expecting him to turn away or disappear like he always did in dreams. But this time he didn't. He looked at her, really looked at her, and said, "I was wrong about you." Just that. 4 words. In the dream, Grace started crying, huge gasping sobs. She fell to her knees in the rain and cried until there was nothing left inside her. When she looked up, her father was gone. The house was gone. She was alone in the rain and it was still falling and it would never stop. She woke with a start. The plane was descending toward Nice. Through the window, she could see the Mediterranean, blue and calm and beautiful. Monaco was just ahead, her palace, her children, her role. Princess Grace was needed. Grace Kelly could keep sleeping. Grace wiped her face and reapplied her lipstick. By the time the plane landed, she was perfect again. Untouchable. The fairy tale princess returning to her kingdom. And if she felt hollow inside, if she felt like she'd buried part of herself in a Philadelphia grave next to her father, well, that was the price. That was what she'd chosen. Or what had chosen her. The mathematics of it didn't matter anymore. Rainier was waiting at the palace. "How was it?" he asked. "Fine," Grace said. "Difficult, but fine." He nodded and returned to his paperwork. That was the extent of their emotional intimacy. Grace went to check on the children. Caroline was doing homework. Albert was reading. Stephanie was already asleep. Grace kissed each of their foreheads and felt a fierce protective love. They would not inherit her numbness. They would not spend their lives performing for distant fathers. She would fail them in other ways, certainly. But not that way. That particular curse ended with her. That night, Grace stood on her balcony overlooking Monaco. The city glittered below her, beautiful and prosperous and thoroughly artificial. Like her. Like everything in her life. She thought about the rain in Philadelphia, about her father's grave, about the 17-year-old girl writing in her journal about all the things she was going to become. None of those things had come true. Or all of them had come true and it still wasn't enough. The math didn't work. The equation didn't balance. She'd given up Grace Kelly to become Princess Grace, and Princess Grace had consumed her so completely that now when she looked in the mirror, she couldn't find any trace of the girl she'd been. The Mediterranean was dark and calm. Grace wondered what would happen if she just stepped off the balcony, let gravity take her, let the performance finally end. But she wouldn't. She had children who needed her. She had duties. She had a role to play. The show must go on. That was the first rule of acting, and Grace had been acting for so long she'd forgotten there was any other way to exist. So she would keep performing. Keep smiling. Keep being Princess Grace until the day she died. And maybe somewhere deep inside, the ghost of Grace Kelly was screaming. But no one could hear her. Not even Grace herself. She went back inside and closed the balcony doors. Tomorrow there would be another ribbon to cut, another charity to support, another public appearance to perfect. The rain had stopped in Philadelphia, but inside Grace it was still falling, steady and relentless and eternal. Some storms never pass. Some cages never open. Some performances never end. Grace understood that now. Her father was dead, but his expectations lived on, written into her DNA, shaping every choice she made or didn't make. She was 30 years old and already felt ancient. The best parts of her life were behind her and the rest stretched ahead like a sentence she had to serve. But she would serve it gracefully. That much she could control. The performance, at least, would be flawless. Even if underneath it, she was drowning. Even if the rain that started at her father's funeral never really stopped. Even if she was slowly disappearing into the role until there was nothing left of Grace Patricia Kelly except a beautiful ghost haunting a palace by the sea.